Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about mental health in sport with Dr Shakiba Moghadam. Shakiba, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for today's discussions.
Yeah, so cool to have you on. We always start with a brief introduction. So tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. I'll try and keep this somewhat brief. So, I'm a chartered psychologist. A lot of my work looks at sports psychology, but more so in the areas of mental health literacy, also looking at athletes who are women who compete in male dominated sports, some of the struggles they may experience, some of the barriers within their sports. I would say more so probably in the last 3 years or so, my work has shifted direction. So now I'm kind of taking a focus on human rights standpoints, human rights violations in sport, and also looking into the concept of how sport can be used within marginalised communities. So it's a nice mix of different interests of mine within my work. I'm currently a lecturer in psychology and also sport and exercise psychology at Solent University on the south coast, and it's been a real great pleasure to be able to work across such a diverse course as well, and have the privilege of teaching both on the psychology and also on the sport and exercise psychology modules as well.
What's your education journey been from a sports psychology perspective? Did you do any degrees in sports psychology?
Yes, yeah. So dating back, I won't say to what year, but dating back to when I did my undergraduate, that was in psychology. And then I did my master's in sport and exercise psychology. I then took a year out to work as a researcher on different projects looking at mental health, particularly in different communities, and also looking at physical activity interventions. And that kind of sparked my interest in the PhD. I did some teaching as well on sports psychology modules, and that's when the following year I started and embarked on my PhD, which looked at mental health literacy in players who identify as women, as rugby players. And that was a really interesting PhD program to pursue, and I've managed to work alongside of it, which at times wasn't always easy, but it was a good experience nonetheless. And so that was kind of my education journey up until today, and working in academia now. Tables have turned.
Why sports psychology? I mean, like me, you've got a first degree in psychology. Was the plan always to do a master's in sports psych, or did that interest emerge as you were doing the psychology degree?
Yes, yeah. I actually had no real interest in sport and exercise psychology until I was actually introduced to it. Before my third year, my undergraduate, we had the option to pick what we wanted to do. We had more autonomy, I guess, over our modules, and I picked a sport and exercise psychology just because the content looked really interesting. And uh, the person who gave a lecture, who actually ended up being part of my supervisory team on my PhD, he gave a really fascinating talk about sport and exercise psychology, and that really took my attention. And at the time, I was competing in amateur boxing. So some of the experiences from that, I think, fitted really well around the concepts that were being taught in the modules. So that again really sparked my interest, and my end of year research project dissertation from undergraduate looked at the experiences of boxers, the kind of strategies they use in boxing to tackle any kind of nerves and struggles they may experience before they actually go into the ring. And that passion, I think, just really grew from there onwards, and just understanding the different areas of sports psychology. I wasn't aware of how many things that actually go on in sport and exercise psychology, and being able to do the masters was again and hugely eye opening. Particularly consultancy work
Mm.
was something I really enjoyed at that time, and just fascinated around the exercise psychology as well, within the module. And that's where I kind of learned about mental health, and again things that perhaps I hadn't learned in undergraduate.
Sports psychology can be very diverse, can't it? Very broad ranging. just dwelling on your participation in boxing. What got you into boxing?
Yeah, I remember I was in my second year of university and I'd stopped drinking and I was looking for sport to take part in where drinking wasn't a huge cultural of the sport itself.
Yes.
I've always loved training, always been into sport, but after my first year of university, and I think just I enjoyed drinking, enjoyed going out, but it came to a point where I thought I do actually want to maybe just stop and see how life is without drinking. And it wasn't any particular kind of deep, meaningful journey I was embarking on. It was just I just wanted to test it out, test the waters without drinking,
Hmm.
which actually led to 5 years of not drinking at all. Um, and I really found the boxing club, Gym I One in Portsmouth, is where I started my journey, and a really amazing club, really welcoming. And the coach at the time had this like kind of unwritten rule that during the season of competition you don't drink, and then that we drink at the end of at the end of the season when we've all kind of had our competitions. Um, but I really enjoyed how strict and disciplined the sessions were.
Hmm.
Um, so I asked if I could take part, and I was welcomed. And it was very, very strict because I was doing the kickboxing before that, and that was more like a fun kind of turn up. We won't compete, which is definitely suited to some people. But I was looking for something a bit more serious. And I think after the first session, I was just hooked, and I really wanted to have a competition and to essentially fight. And I think I had my first fight about 6 months after training, and such a great experience. Kind of when I reflect on it now, and it was a great way for me to just channel the emotions, but particularly heightened emotions, and be able to control them in a very specific kind of arena, I guess. And I really enjoyed that challenge just throughout my boxing journey.
Were you nervous before and during that fight, that first fight?
The first fight was over within the first round. I don't remember much. I just remembered having a huge adrenaline rush, and I TKO'd my opponent within the first minute.
Nice.
Um, and I just remember my coach said for a joke, he was like, "You threw about 100 punches in a minute." And I just remember hitting the girl. She went down, got back up. She got a count, got back up again. And I could hear my coach going, "Take your time." And I was like, "Nah, this is over. I'm not taking my time. I'm just gonna go to the end now."
Nothing like taking heed of your coach's instructions there. No, you're wrong. I'm gonna crack
Yeah,
on.
basically. Yeah, and I do wish I listened to my coach more in that first fight because it finished and he looked so disappointed, and I was like, "Wayne, why don't you look happy? I just won my fight in the first round." And he was like, "Yeah, Shakiba, that's really great, but I wanted you to get the
Hmm.
experience." And I was like, "Oh, next one we'll do that." Um, Next one was just same outcome, but just in the second round. Um, but I eventually kind of got the ropes
Yeah.
and listened to my coach far more. But he had a great way of like coaching me, and I really got his point about me taking my time. And there were scenarios we were imitating in the ring about take your time and actually giving myself the space to listen to his advice and not just see red, basically. Um, so yeah, eventually throughout my career, we had a really great kind of coach athlete relationship, and me listening to him far more better than I did in my first and second fights.
You mentioned completing a master's degree with your dissertation being related to psychological skills in boxing. That was my interpretation of what you said.
Hmm.
Were you still boxing at that time? Did you draw on your experiences? Did you use what you learned in that dissertation for your boxing, or had you finished boxing by that stage?
Yeah, so my master's project looked at the challenges of women boxers and the strategies they use to overcome those challenges. And I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot of new strategies to kind of utilize, but it was a lot of. I think I was going through a really difficult moment and period in my boxing journey, particularly around not only managing my nerves, but it was a point in my career where I was taking the leap into the kind of developmental towards the more elite ranks, and it was a huge change, kind of going into going abroad, sparring people I've never met before. I don't know what their sparring style's like. And that transition I found really difficult. And for my project, I found that actually that transition and that difficulty I was experiencing was common across boxers.
Okay.
And there were some very particular challenges that were very gender specific. There was a lot of backlash for being a woman and competing in boxing. And, you just hear things like, oh, you shouldn't be boxing. It's not a place for a woman to be in the ring. You don't want to ruin your face. And a lot of that for that time, for a certain period of time, it just becomes really annoying and frustrating to hear it. And that was a common theme that was generated from the novice kind of stages to developmental to all the way to the elite kind of ranks. And it was reassuring to kind of know that I wasn't the only one, but at the same time, it was still frustrating because now here I am knowing I'm not the only one. And this is a far bigger issue. Um, so the project itself taught me a lot, and actually I think it took me out of a place where I thought I was on my own. And because boxing is an individual sport and you're on your own a lot of the time,
Mm.
particularly when you are fighting. But as a community, I think it is an incredible community of people who share the same passion. And in this case, being a female in boxing, we do share a lot of the same struggles. So that was comforting whilst also being frustrating.
For your own personal journey, your experiences in boxing, did those kind of comments make you want to, did they just annoy you, or did they want to make you withdraw from boxing, withdraw your participation, walk away from it?
Yeah, I don't think it never occurred to me to walk away. I I think at the beginning I challenged it because one of the times it was after quite a well-known box cup, huge major international competition, and it was one of the referees who came forward, and we were getting, I think we were getting food. It was the second day, and we were getting food quite late at night. And you can tell this referee had had a couple of drinks and
Hmm.
stumbled in the same fish and chip shop that we were in. And he said, he saw my badge I had on from the day, and he said, you're competing in the box cup?" And I said, "Yeah." Asked how I'm finding it, and I said, "Yeah, it's been really good experience and exposure into like the international stage." And he said, "Yeah, I wouldn't have my daughter doing that. Don't think I agree with you being in there and getting punched in the face." And I kind of challenged it, and after realizing me challenging it didn't mean much to them, I thought, actually, why should I be someone who's wasting my energy trying to challenge someone's very closed-minded perspective? um, because I need to go beyond just challenging it. Actually, there needs to be protocols and procedures put into place, particularly when someone's a ref. I'm like, you could be refing my fight tomorrow, and you have this mentality. Are you going to pay much attention to the scoring system? Is your decision making going to be skewed because maybe you don't want to be watching us fight? Um, so, if anything, I think it made me challenge my own kind of dialogue and the way I would deal with it. But it actually ended up kind of changing some of my direction in sports psychology and some of the work that I pursued later on and some of the projects I worked on, particularly with England boxing, with GB boxing. So I think a lot of good came out of it, out of that frustration, because I managed to just channel it in a way that was productive rather than the frustration that I felt just kept letting it build and build, and it diffused when I actually found some power in it in terms of trying to change something.
Well, can you, respecting what you can and can't speak to, the work you've done over the years then with England boxing, British boxing, was it very much about striving to educate and help change a narrative around women's boxing? Was that very much your goal in the work you were doing with England boxing?
Yeah, I think I realised that I need to have something to fall back on, and I really pushed for my master's project to be published so that I had the talking point. So that was kind of my first steps, and then I proposed that to. Luckily, there's some England boxing have some incredible people work for them, and I reached out to some that I knew through just free boxing and seeing them at different camps, and they were really incredible and quick to essentially take the opportunity to hear me out. So I introduced them to some of my findings, and they were really keen to hear about essentially the psychological impact it has on women boxers. Um, and that led to essentially me delivering a number of workshops around the challenges that were highlighted on my master's paper that I ended up publishing. And a lot of it was around the menstrual cycle, and how this is a very gender and health specific concern for women boxers, particularly when they have only three weight categories at the Olympics to meet. And some were taking very drastic and extreme weight cutting strategies to meet the weight. And that led to some really great, interesting workshops with GB coaches in the end, who were predominantly men and who weren't really familiar with how to, or at least to what extent, menstrual cycle can impact a woman's psychological and also physical health, particularly with the different kind of the phases you have in a menstrual cycle, and actually tailoring training strategies so that women can train around their cycle, but also the, the best get the best kind of tailored approach they can, and essentially be able to perform optimally. We spoke about the psychological impact, which a lot of people weren't aware of, how that concept of water retention can actually feel overwhelming sometimes, particularly in boxing when you can get take body shots. How comments that can be derogatory can make someone feel in their sport, how that can have impact on someone's mental health. We talked about kind of derogatory comments made in gyms again, around, get down and do a push up like a girl, or stop sparring and hitting like a girl. Well, what does that do in the long term, and also what kind of example is that setting for generations that are coming up? Um, Conversations that England and GB were ready to hear, and I think that was just definitely a step in the right direction. And now I do kind of just freelance work every now and then for them. I delivered some workshops last month in a club in London. That was really great. Again, just gathering female boxers from around different clubs in London and just delivering the psychology part of what it's like to be a boxer. And so it's been a really great kind of huge strides within boxing, amateur boxing. And I think there's a lot more that can be done, but it's a step at a time, and absolutely going in the right way right now.
It strikes me it's a combination of educating coaches, upskilling them, their knowledge around the experiences of women athletes, of women boxers, and also education around communication tools, and even psychological skills or psychological tools, in order to incorporate those into the coaching sessions, training sessions. Those three
Yeah.
things sort of thrown into into the coaching cocktail, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is again. It's this mini step, but it's coaches being one aware, and then two actually open to having discussions like, are you on your menstrual cycle? Do you want to tailor your training for this session? What about if we don't spar in this session when we focus on pad work or on bag work? Perhaps they don't want to get hit in the stomach because this might be the first day of the cycle. How about we just focus on head movement in sparring? So it's just those strategies, and the conversation, the stigma that exists at the moment, this taboo around menstrual cycle, does need to slowly get lifted off, and essentially that can become a topic that can get openly spoken about and considered within boxing clubs. Because, and I think this expands across so many different sports. A lot of my work for my PhD was in rugby, and it's just acknowledgement that it does exist. It's not taboo. Let's have a talk about it. And if the females in the club feel comfortable, then let's try and get something sorted in terms of the training program, um, because everyone wants optimal performance, whether it's the athlete or the coach, and let's work together to get that.
We so often talk about the importance and potential impact of being facilitative in your coaching, being autonomy supportive. And it sounds like the menstrual cycle is yet another reason to individualize a training plan, um, when we're thinking about women's participation in sport.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think just encouraging athletes to track their menstrual cycle again is another stepping stone, step in the right direction, because then you've got concrete evidence to then also go off. Is there's so many different apps out there as well, or just simple, pen and paper. if you're a bit old school, just track it and see, take some notes, reflect, see how you feel. It fluctuates, it can change, but is there certain things that may trigger good training sessions? Is there certain things that might trigger not so productive training session? Um, there's certain phases where ACL injury is more prevalent because of the hormones that's being released in a woman's body, and so actually there's some exercises that should be avoided during this menstrual cycle to avoid or at least decrease the risk of injury. So lots to be discussed, and a starting point is just that tracking and coaches encouraging their athletes to track their menstrual cycle as a starting point.
And a more flexible lens around, I mean, we use these terms interchangeably: mental toughness, mental strength, mental skill, but a more flexible lens around these, that during a menstrual cycle,
Absolutely.
with the experiences that women have, just being a little bit more flexible as to what somebody can and can't achieve during those times.
Yeah, I think it is being flexible and absolutely, and seeing how the body is going to respond. Everyone's different. Some people, when I have spoken to women athletes around this, some said, "Oh, it doesn't really do anything for me. I just crack on with it." Others are, it's a absolutely can stop them
Mm.
from training entirely, and it depends, if you're experiencing kind of post menstruation kind of symptoms, if your body is just going into shutdown mode. It's different for everyone, and so it's understanding this tailored approach. Some it doesn't impact at all, others it might impact in a certain way, but it is absolutely around that tailored approach and just having a conversation to begin with.
You mentioned earlier that you completed a PhD in the area of mental health. I think you mentioned that during your master's degree that you became interested in this area. Perhaps it stood out for you a little bit, and became an area that you thought you might extend your study on. Can you tell me a little bit about the genesis of that PhD? What got you really interested in this area, and I know it was in women's rugby. Why women's rugby? Can you talk a little bit to this, please?
Yes, of course. I think I'm gonna have to give the credit here to Dr. Paul Gruninsky. He was, I would say, one of my main inspirations behind that work. A lot of his work is and was on mental health, but particularly around mental health literacy. And before meeting Paul, I wasn't really familiar with mental health literacy, and now I've written a whole thesis on it. And
You've done a whole PhD. You are a doctor of mental health literacy.
who would have thought it? And it was just, for me, mental health has been an interesting topic throughout, I think, psychology. And I feel like I speak on behalf of so many other people who have taken an interest in psychology. It's something that will always be relevant. It's always been relevant in the past. It has an endless relevance. And I think that's where the discussion of it is so important. But particularly in sport, I think it was a very taboo topic to speak about. And this concept of taboo was prevalent for, I think, within all athletes, within all sports. There wasn't a sport where I thought, or at least evidence would suggest, particularly 10 years ago, that this one particular sport you can speak about mental health and help seeking and nobody would hold any judgments. It was this constant stigma that existed across all sports and not only in society. And with athletes down in particularly at that elite professional level and being in media and the public eye, and how detrimental not speaking about their mental health actually became, to the point, a lot of my talks go back to Ricky Hatton and kind of when he hit rock bottom and essentially attempted suicide, and what that can in its extreme form look like. So there were so many different conversations to be had, and when we just the topic of mental health was introduced um, towards the latter part of my masters, and it was almost just just a small part of one of the modules, but it really captured my attention because it did make me think. I do wonder how many of these athletes that I watch, compete. What are their struggles outside of their sport? If there are any struggles, and what does that look like for them? And going on, just before I did my PhD, I decided to take up some work around mental health messaging. It was more so, the projects differed. There was one project looking at mental health messaging within people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and how the messaging, the way it was worded, the discourse, how that then impacted people essentially seeking help. And I I found that really interesting because if essentially we're not the message, and if that's not put out correctly, that could stop a whole population of people seeking help. And it's not just one or two people. We're speaking about thousands and thousands of people not engaging, but purely based on the concept that it hasn't been worded in a particular welcoming, and I use this word inclusive in a very meaningful way, but it is encompassing of everyone going and gaining help, not just one particular group of people. So that really sparked my interest, and then Paul knew that I was really interested in the area, and he suggested this project that may be coming up around mental health literacy. And he knew my work was on athletes, women athletes who compete in male-dominated sports, and rugby was one of those. So it was something that was mentioned, and I didn't really give it much thought until I decided I want to do a PhD rather than a prof doc in sport and exercise psychology. Um, and I saw the PhD advertised, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. It aligns with my interest. It aligns with some of the work I've done. And outside of boxing, I hadn't really tapped into any other kind of male-dominated sports with the existence of women in it. So I gave it a go, and it was successful in the end, which was really, I'm super grateful I was. And that's kind of what sparked the journey. And the project itself wasn't actually focusing on women to begin with. I just had the idea that it could be focused on women. And in the first kind of 6 months, we did a review, a systematic review, and
Okay.
I think I went in with my own assumptions of there's going to be so much research because rugby is such a traditional sport. Concussion is so prevalent in rugby, as well as other kind of physical injuries. But of course, head trauma being concussion was huge. And I thought, well, there's going to be loads of research on this because injuries can also impact athletes' well-being. And to my surprise, I think out of the filtering and the search and data synthesis, there was just 8 studies that looked at rugby players and their mental health. And out of those 8 studies, only one of them looked at women rugby players. And even within that one study, the ratio was just so out of range. I think there was like 280 something, top of my head, male rugby players and 43 women rugby players. And I thought, well, that quickly humbled me. And I dropped all my assumptions around assuming there was so much research around this
Hmm.
topic, particularly for women rugby players. And that's when I decided, well, I think this project can just focus on women rugby players because one, it's a gap, and I'm not just talking a small gap. I'm talking a huge astronomical gap that existed within literature and in sports psychology. And towards, I think at the early stages of the PhD, I found that somewhat overwhelming because I felt like the responsibility then fell on me to deliver a good piece of PhD because it's some of the first kind of steps within this area. And I'm super lucky to have had Paul there, I think, along the way with me because he was amazing at guiding kind of the direction. Because I just want to do everything at once. I just said, there's nothing on here. How could this be the case? We need to do something now. Let's do this. Let's go and interview them. Let's go send out these questionnaires. Let's go. And I want to find out so much more, which was great. But at the same time, that I reflect on it was, yeah, I can also understand why I became so overwhelmed so quickly. Um, because I've seen some of the same kind of stereotypes that I experienced as a boxer, but not within rugby. And I thought, oh, here we go again, another sport that there's nothing on it, and where when really we've got a lot of work to do as professionals in this field. So that's kind of where it led, and the topic around it was around mental health literacy again, an area that was untouched, absolutely untouched. And mental health literacy, it comes from a health perspective. There's it was born out of health
Okay.
literacy and kind of the general population's understanding around managing their health, being able to kind of signpost not only themselves but also their friends to where to gain help and be able to kind of at least spot some of their symptoms they might have around a certain illness. But mental health literacy specifically looks at our own understanding around mental health symptoms and disorders, our own understanding of knowing where to go, how to engage in mental health help seeking strategies. Do we go to a GP or do we go to our family or friends, or do we not say anything at all? Um, and it's having understanding not only for ourselves but also for others who are around us. And this hasn't really even now hasn't been explored in anywhere near enough within the sports setting for athletes. So it was a really interesting kind of first steps to take, to just understand those kind of behaviours and attitudes within a population of women rugby players.
So would I be right in suggesting that when one thinks of mental health literacy, listening to what you've just said, it made me think that this notion of literacy is a kind of a keen combination of knowledge and awareness, having a general knowledge of mental health, but also an awareness of self and awareness of others as well. Awareness of, well, okay, so I know this stuff about mental health. What am I experiencing right now? Is this related? And what does this mean to others? It just those two words hit me as you were speaking: knowledge and awareness.
Absolutely. It is. And it's the recognition that symptoms can differ across people. For example, one symptom for depression might look completely different from mine to yours, for example, and how that may manifest itself. And it's about then what happens afterwards. Do people know where to go to get help? What are their intentions? And then what are their behaviors after that? So it's absolutely encompassing of those two terms. And it goes kind of beyond just ourselves, but our awareness for others. And it's interesting in a sporting context because, you have team sports, but you have individual sports, but you are still coached by someone. And it's understanding, sometimes, of course, no athlete and no coach or official even is immune to experiencing mental health symptoms or disorders. But of course, they have different ways of manifesting themselves, have different ways of showing themselves. And that was one thing I really learned throughout my PhD, and particularly when I started interviewing the rugby players, how different that actually looked across the field for so many different people, and what their strategies were. And one thing I found really interesting within this project was mental health literacy. There's a mental health literacy scale you can use to essentially measure someone's mental health literacy. And mental health literacy in women rugby players is actually really high. It's amongst one of the highest scoring when you compare it to other populations like students or medical professionals. It was really high. So it was interesting to see that this subgroup of athletes actually had really good knowledge. They knew where to go, but even though they knew where to go, when it came to looking at their intentions, they wouldn't. They wouldn't, even though they wanted to go and they knew exactly where to go. They wouldn't go and get the help, and that just opened a different avenue of questions of, well, you've got a really high mental health literacy, but your intentions are really low. You're not going to engage in any kind of help seeking behaviors, even when you can spot the signs and symptoms in yourself and in others, and you know kind of where to go for get that help. You're telling me that you won't for these different surveys and questionnaires. So that was really interesting, and unexpected, of course, as well.
I'd like to unpack that. I just want to briefly back up because I am conscious, because sometimes this is a bit of a conflict in my own mind, and I work in this area, about how when one thinks about, I mean, we're talking about mental health literacy here, but actually, when perhaps you look at this in granular detail, different people have different, obviously, understandings about mental health, but when you personally, you're so invested in this area, this is your living, you've
Yeah.
done your PhD on this. When you think of mental health, what do you mean by mental health? What things do you think of in terms of experiences, human experiences, when it comes to mental health?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I can chew your ear off for days, but for the sake of this, I won't. um,
No, please do, please do.
I think for me personally, having not only worked in this, but having seen, I think, how people speak about it, I think really for me, and this is very subjective, it goes back to functioning, human
Right.
functioning, and looking at as a human how am I
Yeah.
functioning, and looking at my patterns across my day to day, my emotional patterns, my functioning patterns, my social patterns, my work habits. Am I getting out of bed around the same time? Am I even getting out
Yeah.
of bed? Am I getting up and making my bed? Am I following my small day to day routines? Am I washing my face? Am I brushing my teeth? Am I taking my shower? Then looking at eating behaviors. Am I neglecting eating? Is there only one particular food now that I would only eat? Am I drinking enough water? Hydration, eating, survival goes back to function, and I think survival being another factor. How am I surviving? And if those concepts are in some way taking a hit, if my survival is taking a hit, if my function is taking a hit, then to me that's suggesting there's something around my mental health that could be impacting that. So for me, it's like drawing things out around my functioning and my survival.
Examining my moment to moment behaviors. What behaviors am I engaging in? And the ease in which I'm engaging in those behaviors.
Hmm, absolutely, and I think you're spot on. And much of this goes back to that the concept of coping. How does that coping then look like as
Yeah.
well?
I think it's a really fascinating landscape because as messaging has improved in the sporting landscape, and I think maybe this is one area that social media has been a force for the positive, but also understanding it can be actually social media. I don't want to go back on what I've just said, but I will
Yeah.
add. I will add that social media is a serious cause of people's mental health problems. Let me just be clear about that. Um, but the reason why I'm saying, in a way, it has been a force for positive because there have been people opening up on social media and normalizing mental ill health.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
whilst also recognizing the evils that social media plays on us as human beings. And we can speak more to that in a bit. I think where I'm going down that path is Shakiba, because I work in this area as well. I've
Hmm.
sometimes wondered if, from a messaging perspective, and you spoke earlier about the importance of messaging, that mental health and well-being are two terms that are used together. In fact, there's definitions of mental health that use the term well-being in there, and are actually in your papers when I've read them, and they're good definitions. But sometimes I've almost found myself, or I have found myself, when I've spoken to coaches, clubs, organizations, and spoken about mental health and tried to help them unpack this and disseminate between different experiences, human experiences, and disorders, that are sometimes I have found myself saying, well, there's well-being and welfare. There's, if we
Yeah.
unpack sports psychology, sometimes it's useful to say, look, there is performance psychology, there is well-being, player well-being and welfare, which is kind of the day-to-day basic management around thoughts, emotions, and feelings. But there's nothing pathological or overly maladaptive about those thoughts, emotions, feelings. They're kind of
Yeah.
just dealing with the day-to-day challenges that are thrown at you. And then there are mental health challenges where low mood can become serious clinical depression, eating disorders,
Yes.
personality disorders, etc., etc. So I've almost, I'm probably not leaning on any science whatsoever there. I've just in my own practice found that a useful distinguishment between the three. And I'm happy for you to tell me that I'm completely wrong there, but I think it's an interesting landscape.
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I think it's also understanding the difference between functioning and dysfunctioning as well, and how what dysfunctioning looks like, and how this a dysfunctioning behavior could actually then lead to a diagnosis
Mm.
of a mental health disorder, for example. Um, and I think when we do break it down at its core, it is understanding functioning and dysfunction and what that dysfunction could then lead to. And I think one thing is to understand perhaps the context of how what does, for example, I think you highlighted really well about low mood, and that low mood can be part of your day to day.
Yes.
You might drop a cup of coffee and then it's putting you in a bit of a not so good mood because you've got to clean up, and then you deal with that and then you move on, and then your low mood's then lifted, and you're kind of in this steady state. But then what happens when that low mood then is just stuck and it just gets lower and lower, and you are stuck down there in that low mood. Now we're talking about longer periods of time. And I think that distinction that you said was absolutely spot on. And that's when we are now kind of going towards those different forms of depression. We're looking at maybe a chronic depression, or we're looking at different type of depression. Is this just depressive symptoms?
Yeah.
And that's when we can have those dysfunctioning conversations now as well, because is this concept of low mood now leading to dysfunctional behaviors as well? And I think it's absolutely understanding that difference. But it really does go back to the way we speak about it. And particularly, even I think coaches hold such an important role within these conversations. And sometimes a role that is comes with a lot to deal with. Because more often than not, athletes go to their coaches first for support, um, even if it's not within someone's specialty. And so it's important to for coaches just to be aware. They don't have to be professionals, absolutely not. And I think it'd be so unrealistic to have those expectations, but just to know at least where to signpost athletes. And it goes back to that conversation of messaging of
Mm.
mental health. And I think every coach can really benefit from perhaps looking at within their own sport and seeing if there's a particular charity, or looking at the governing bodies and if the governing body has suggested any kind of mental health support, and just doing the element of just research just to see if the time came and they had to signpost someone, whether someone is just asking for help or if someone's in a crisis point, where can they signpost them to? Particularly, when someone is edging over to crisis point, then that's looking at kind of perhaps medical support, instant medical support from NHS.
I'm going to press the pause button on that, and I'm keen to return to it because with all the coaches listening in, I know they'd be keen to get some ideas around the environment that they create and what they can do to consider the mental health of their players. I do want to return to the specifics of your PhD because you said something really interesting that the rugby players, the women rugby players that you studied, and you said actually the mental health literacy was very
Yeah,
high, but they didn't necessarily engage in help seeking
yeah,
behaviors. Can you unpack that a bit? Because I would imagine that is not uh, necessarily that unusual in sport, because that's maybe the landscape that sport brings with it. But yeah, can you unpack that a bit for us? Why is that the case, or why was that the case?
yeah. Of course, I think so. That kind of led over to the qualitative work that was then kind of essentially done to unpack the results. And there were just
Mm,
huge barriers to actually seeking professional support. And much of these barriers were associated with the concept of stigma. And it wasn't just stigma, from public, but it was actually sometimes self stigma. There's kind of internalization of, how are people going to see me if I was to go and speak about my mental health? Um, and essentially, you kind of judging yourself about your own intentions of just speaking about mental health, let alone actually going and seeking support. So that was one huge area, was this different
mm,
types of stigma that people spoke about, and kind of also just highlighted. Another kind of barrier was that some people just don't have good experiences, previous experiences. If there was a moment that they actually did go and seek support, um, it may have not been a good experience for them. Perhaps, some spoke about the fact that the support was just really vague and they didn't feel like they were being heard. Um, and that just wasn't, for some, they said it was an embarrassing experience and one that I don't want to experience again. And I think to hear that as
mm.
someone who's been in psychology it was really frustrating again. And to think that we're, how gaining support and speaking about how you feel is not the easiest of things to do for a lot of people. And someone's built up the courage and the energy to just go and seek help. At the end of it, they just didn't get the help that they needed, and that they were essentially, sometimes someone said I felt like I was brushed off, I wasn't listened to, um, and they weren't taken serious enough. I think this concept of not being taken serious enough was just common conversation that kept coming up. So there was a lot to kind of unpack there about the barriers they experienced. They knew where to go. That was the thing. Like some of the barriers that usually does come up, even a lot of athletic, populations are just didn't really know who to go to. They knew who to go to, um, but they just felt that there was these barriers. And some also said, there was just limited support for them within their respective sport. And they said, we see our male counterparts. They have sports psychologists come in. They have workshops for them, whereas we don't get anything like that for us. And I think this feeling of being like second best just didn't help the way they felt anyway. And I think as for their identity was just a bit. I think it's a bit of a slap in the face, really, when you think about it. You are an athlete and you are competing for your club, but actually you're not still seen as a team or as essentially a good player, and you're almost seen as just a group of people that may get the hand downs, secondary parts of like they spoke about kit, for example, how kit would get handed out to them from the men's, and how they felt like that when it came to also mental health support within their respective clubs.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just one or two clubs; this was clubs across England. It wasn't just a couple of clubs and from a group of people I spoke to. It was a common concept that existed across the different clubs. So addressing the problem has to start at looking at the makeup of one of the clubs, but also, are these conversations even being had at the higher levels within the governing body?
Do you think those conversations are being had at the highest levels? Has that been your experience?
Oh, absolutely not. No, no, honestly, I don't think it is. And I think I think if you look at on the surface, you can see that there's some information around mental health and there's some guidance, but that's not to be confused with the fact that the conversation is being had or not. And I think
Mm.
that's a complete different area of work because it really has to come from the top down where information is being filtered and trickled through different clubs. And we're not just talking about elite clubs, we're talking about those grassroots. And those grassroots, this notion of help seeking needs to become normalized right from the start, right from grassroots, so that that behavior and the conversation becomes not only apparent but becomes a normalized concept within the sport, so that when someone does reach the elite stages and they feel anxious and they might feel like they're juggling a lot of different pressures, they can speak about it rather than just shut down those
Mm.
emotions and just think, you know what, I'll deal with them later. I can't be speaking about this because I don't want to seem like I'm weak. I'm meant to be, at the elite, at the top of my game. Whereas that's not the case. Talking about your mental health isn't that you're weak. You're just seeking support for something that's concerning you. And when I was having this conversation, I always brought up the fact that, I always ask the question, have you been injured? And more often than not with rugby players, they have absolutely been injured. And I said, no, what did you do? When
Yep.
somewhat, two of them said they tore their ACL. And I said, oh, what did you do when you tore your ACL? And they said, oh, well, went to see the physio at the club. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So what would have happened if you didn't go and seek support for your ACL? And they said, well, it would have deteriorated and I would have been out of play completely or forced to retire. And if you flip down instead and talk about mental health, just because we can see it and it might not be diagnosed in the same way, why are we not having the same attitudes when we have acknowledged that actually there's something that here that may be causing some level of discomfort or distress? I'm going to go seek support for this now rather than wait until it's so detrimental that I can't no longer function in my day to day life. And it is the concept of the fact that we can't see it. We just can't see mental health. And I do believe if we as humans we actually saw what mental health does to us, we would seek support as soon as we just feel that level of discomfort and distress.
Yes.
And this is why that conversation needs to be had from the top, because then they can introduce early preventative interventions to tackle these the lack of support systems that's currently not available at all throughout grassroots.
Do you think the lack of support is down purely to resources? Do you think it's coach education? or key stakeholder education, if I think about those who are involved in and around clubs?
Absolutely. I think I wouldn't say there's just one root kind of concept here. I think it is across. So if we speak about rugby as a sport, it's across the game. We're talking about the officials, the coaches, stakeholders. It is educating and making them aware all together. So if you are involved in rugby, even if you are someone who is a significant other, a family member, it's also making you aware of those because you may not be familiar with the athlete, but you're familiar with the person. So it's making you aware. So if you have a foot in rugby, then this also involves you. And I think educating fans is another huge area that governing bodies can work on. And I think there's been some really interesting campaigns that have come out around mental health, but also around how fans can impact athletes' mental health by, particularly on social media and the kind of cyberbullying and harassing athletes, and what impact that can have on athletes' mental health in the long term and in the short term as well. Um, but it starts with, again, I take rugby as a sport I'm talking about. Everyone who has a foot in that sport, they hold a responsibility to be an advocate of athletes' mental health
Mm.
and have the responsibility to make themselves aware of at least just some of the components of that sport and how that sport can impact an athlete's mental health.
So, for those coaches who are listening in, and obviously there are coaches who have different commitments within coaches. Some listening in are full time coaches, some listening in contrast that completely and coach once a week on a wet Wednesday night for an hour and a half. And that's the only interaction by and large they have with their players. So, a fairly broad brush question here, but what considerations should coaches have for their players' mental health? What consideration should they have for their coaching practice? What kind of key suggestions might you have for those coaches listening in?
Yeah, I think one thing I do want to say around coaches is it's a job that encompasses so many different roles and
Mm,
identities. Because, like you said, you have the professional coach who might get paid, that's their kind of full time job. You have coaches who absolutely just love a sport and will volunteer their time.
mm,
And to add another kind of responsibility on them, it shouldn't be, I wouldn't want to make that a burden, but something that would only improve them as a coach and it would give them more resources to look after their athlete. We spoke about athlete welfare, and for optimal performance, athletes need to be not only performing optimally but mentally as well. And essentially arming yourself with knowledge and at least some element of awareness is a stepping stone for all coaches, I think. And I think this is where also coaches can demand more from their governing bodies to help them and give them the resources or the training. For example, I can take the mental health first aid course. I think that's a stepping stone. I don't think it's the answer. I think it's just
mm,
a stepping stone.
mm,
Um, but the collective voices of coaches almost lobbying governing bodies to help them have the resources so that they can arm themselves with the knowledge of how do I even spot mental health symptoms, what does that look like. And the intervention that I did for part of the kind of latter phases of the PhD was a mental health literacy intervention. It was aimed at athletes, but there's tons of research done with also with how those workshops are so effective with just coaches and those that are involved in the sport themselves as well. And we're talking, a couple of hours of workshop where you're just having the conversation and people can ask questions in a comfortable environment. And I think it's taking the support to coaches rather than expecting coaches to go to the support, because it's making that support then more accessible. And coaches have to go and ask collectively. The collective voice is really powerful.
mm.
Collectively demand that from your governing bodies because they are there to also protect athletes and also the coaches and the officials as well, and get the support to come to them rather than them having to go to the support. Um, they're already doing a lot for the sport, so let's arm them with the necessary support that they need to also be able to help the athletes when the time comes.
And to close our conversation, I just want to dwell briefly on the very highest level of sports where the resources are rife and the organisations involved have the money, the capability to employ the right people to deliver on this, to help support the organisation, to help support the athletes, to help support the coaches in an appropriate fashion. I know that, I mean, this is the right people, whether you describe that as qualified people, people with the right protective mechanisms behind them. This is always an ongoing thing, as our profession can be the Wild West at times. And I know this is something that you've been concerned about. You've written quite a bit about this or
Yes.
spoken quite a bit about this recently. Can you speak to this a little bit for me, please? Just, who should these organizations be looking towards, and what do you think is happening in this landscape right now that concerns you?
Of course, yeah, this is an area I feel so passionate about. And I think it is the responsibility of those organizations, the governing bodies, who are put in the position and they're absolutely accountable for providing professional people within those roles. So, for example, if we are looking at someone to bring in to work with athletes on their mental health, on their well-being, and on their psychological skills, that professional needs to meet certain requirements and the criteria. And this isn't a topic where it's subjective. It's actually rather objective because it's not my opinion. It's going off certain criteria and qualifications that
Mm,
someone should have. And I think it's important that the people who are within these positions, because they do hold a lot of power, particularly around education and knowledge, and how that knowledge is being transferred and the messaging around that knowledge to athletes and to coaches and to officials, and that they have to hold a certain level of qualification to be able to deliver that kind of information. Because if you don't have the necessary qualifications, then you are missing huge gaps out of this kind of conversation. You're missing the theories, the evidence that have proven certain practices as valuable and practices that sporting organizations should be embedded in. But then if an individual doesn't have certain qualifications, then that knowledge doesn't exist for them. And I think there's there's one point to be said here around organizations and particularly governing bodies doing their due diligence. That's what they owe to the athletes, is due diligence. Do your research and look at who you're employing to bring in to essentially deliver components around mental health, around mental skills training. Because if those individuals are not qualified, they are, and I say this with confidence, doing far more damage than any good. If someone has lived experiences, I think that's valuable, absolutely. But that doesn't qualify someone to deliver a psychological intervention. Lived experience is one thing, being qualified is another thing,
mm,
and they are not to be mixed up. I think that there is so much to say around this topic, and I go back to qualifications because essentially when I'm going to when I was applying for jobs, I had to prove my qualifications and then go through a series of interviews to also show different skills in different areas. That rigorous method needs to be applied within these positions and the employment of these people as well. Because you can have someone who can sell themselves perfectly from a business perspective, but then when you strip that down and look at their practices, how ethical are those practices? How evidence informed are those practices? And sometimes I feel like when we speak about evidence and research, that can come across a bit intimidating, maybe a bit scary, but it's actually breaking down and saying that what we're saying is proof and it's valid and it's reliable. And by valid and reliable, we're referring to the fact that there has been work and studies done on this to support the practice.
mm,
And many of the individuals who are not qualified within these professions have a one size fits all approach. And that approach, in my eyes, is very dangerous And I go back again to saying it does more harm than any good, because the words that come out of people's mouth can seem very pretty and very good and very seductive almost, in the way that it can encourage people to think, oh wow, this is making a lot of sense. But when someone is deep in depression, deep on the verge of suicidal thoughts, it can take a couple of sentences to push them over the edge, because that's
Mm.
what crisis point is. And when individuals are not qualified in these areas, and they're not entirely sure how they can manage those situations and deal with those situations, their couple of wrong sentences can push them over the edge. And I take that as an extreme example, but some, if I strip it back a little bit and not take it to an extreme example, but an example that is nonetheless valid, a couple of different wrong wordings could discourage someone from pursuing their career as full time, or pursuing perhaps that transition into the elite category. So it's looking at the impact that those words can have on someone or a team. And I just, this self-help gurus that we spoke about social media earlier, self-help gurus that we see across sport, unfortunately, with fancy names, they can come up with the most fanciest seductive names that sounds great, and you think, oh, I could do with one of those. But actually, again, when we strip it back and when we question them on their practice, it's usually the defense mechanisms goes up and you don't actually get an answer, or you get a very waffly answer that doesn't make much sense actually, and it's very vague. And it's important for organizations to do their due diligence and do their research to make sure the people they have to protect the athletes are actually doing exactly that and protecting the athletes, rather than actually exposing them to harm. And I think people within who have gone through the training are so now familiar with ethics, and ethics plays such an important role in anything we do. And those ones, the people that are these health help gurus, unfortunately, ethics isn't a big part of their role, because much of their model is business rather than well-being or mental health, depending on what concept they're speaking about, or psychological skills. And I I sit on one of the workshops. So myself and three other colleagues, we run the workshop for the SEPAR program through BASES, so the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, and we deliver all things equality, diversity, inclusivity. And one of the conversations that for me goes back to is how a psychologist approach does need to be diverse. It does need to be inclusive, and how does that actually look like in real life? How does that look like in the applied world? And then I go back and I look at self-help gurus and I think you're literally everything I've just you're the opposite of everything I've just spoken about in this workshop. And unfortunately, I refer to these individuals as catfish sports psychologists. It's they're masking themselves under a name that doesn't really exist. And they are taking, unfortunately, they're taking the opportunity away from these professionals who are coming through the ranks and through training. And I feel for them, because I think you've taken this path to gain your qualifications by these means. And unfortunately, there's organisations who don't do their due diligence, who don't, abide by their own practices and their own kind of systems they have, and they employ people who are not right for the job, and it leaves people who are qualified and who are so eager to get in and to support athletes in a place where they can't even get a job in the profession, or it's a temporary job, or jobs that are just not paid well enough. And that for me is really problematic at the moment, because there is absolutely an accountability for governing bodies, including educational governing bodies, to step up and to have clear boundaries within this conversation, to enable those that are coming through the ranks to have the best opportunities to go into sport and to deliver those services effectively, and to essentially look after the future generation of athletes.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
Shakiba, thank you so much for this today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Before I let you go, what's next? What's caught your attention right now that you're interested in researching? Yeah, what's on the horizon for you?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think I mentioned earlier around some of my work. on human rights violations. And I think it was this time last year I was appointed as the co-chair of the British Psychological Society's Human Rights Advisory Group, and just through the involvement and chairing that group, it's been a really eye-opening experience. And I think sport has has so much and so many different, I guess, human rights conversations that needs to be had within sport. Sport is such an important tool that can be used and utilized in different ways, but also its athletes across the globe face different types of violations. And I think, from pay to harassment to abuse, and that has definitely taken my attention. And it's an area in terms of human rights violations within sport that I really want to kind of explore more now with a couple of colleagues I'm working out with in Canada, and they've been amazing with some of the work they do, particularly around what happened with the women's gymnastics team, around what's
Mm.
currently happening with the Canadian national hockey team. So it's just been really interesting conversations around that, and that for me has taken so much of my interest right now in sport, and seeing, where can we go from here, and there are conversations that do really need to be had rather than swept under the carpet, for the sake of athlete. Not only, we spoke about mental health and well-being, not only, for the reasons of course, dealing with those tragedies, but also making sport accessible and a safe environment for everyone, and for future generations who are coming through.
Sounds like a good follow-up podcast.
Absolutely.
We'll do that. We'll do that. We'll do that. Brilliant. Now, I mean, I know that everything we've spoken about, you would have really tapped the interest of those listening in. So, how can people find you, follow you, and potentially get in touch with you?
Absolutely. So you will find me on Twitter, Shakiba Moghadam. I'm also on LinkedIn. Those are the kind of areas where I do a lot of my dissemination of my work. You will find me on Twitter every now and then beefing with self-help gurus about
Yeah.
their practices.
I'll have to look that one up.
It is.
And I assume that they can find any contact details on the Solent website.
Yes, so you can look up my staff email on Solent University staff
Brilliant.
profiles. It's shakiba.com at solent.ac.uk. You can always drop me a message on LinkedIn, you can drop me a message on Twitter, or you can email me. Either way, I'm definitely happy to have any kind of conversations and just be of help any way I can.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.